I never imagined we'd actually return to Adventure Valley. For my sister Charlotte and me, this amusement park wasn't just a fun place to visit, it was like a second home. Summers were spent running through its colorful pathways, with rides soaring high above us, and the air filled with the sweet scent of cotton candy and popcorn. Each corner of the park held some cherished memory, and those memories remained vivid in our minds, even as the years passed. Adventure Valley was where magic and thrill intertwined, creating an experience we thought would last forever. But time, as it always does, had changed everything. Years had passed since the last time we'd set foot there. It had shut down, locked behind rusting gates, slowly fading into a distant memory, but the idea of going back never fully disappeared. We talked about it often, wondering what had become of the place that held so much of our childhood. And now that dream was about to come true, not just for Charlotte and me, but for a few of our closest friends who shared the same nostalgic connection to Adventure Valley. Tyler, Brandon, Koji, Scott, and Danny, all of them had been part of those summer days filled with laughter and excitement, and we all wanted to see the park one last time. As we approached the park in the car, an intense wave of memories and emotions washed over me. In my mind, Adventure Valley was still the same vibrant place I had last seen as a child. I could picture the colorful Ferris wheel spinning against the blue sky and hear the faint echoes of delighted screams from the roller coasters. But as we pulled closer, the reality of the present began to sink in. The Adventure Valley we remembered was gone, replaced by something different, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite explain. The entrance came into view, and a chill ran down my spine. The bright colors that had once defined the park had faded, replaced by muted, peeling paint that barely clung to the worn-out structures. The once bustling ticket booths stood abandoned, their windows clouded with dust, and the iconic Adventure Valley sign above the entrance now hung crookedly, with letters chipped and rusted. It was a far cry from the place of wonder and magic we remembered. I exchanged a glance with Charlotte. She looked as uneasy as I felt, her smile strained and hesitant. It was clear that none of us wanted to admit that this place felt different, darker, almost haunted. Graffiti was scrawled across the faded walls, and the messages it held were unsettling. "Stay away," "They're watching," and "This place is cursed," were hastily scribbled in uneven, jagged letters. Each message seemed to scream a warning, as though someone, perhaps the park itself, was trying to tell us that we were intruding on something we shouldn't disturb. Tyler broke the silence, trying to lighten the mood with a laugh, but even he couldn't hide the apprehension in his eyes. We all shared a strange, unspoken understanding as we crossed the threshold, stepping into a place that felt less like a playground of memories and more like a graveyard of lost dreams. The path ahead was familiar yet foreign, like a faded photograph from another life. As we ventured deeper into the park, memories began to resurface, each one clashing with the eerie reality of what Adventure Valley had become. Tyler pointed out the Ferris wheel, still towering above the dilapidated landscape like a ghostly reminder of our past. It used to be our favorite ride, a place where we'd shout and laugh, each rotation lifting us high enough to see the entire park spread out below. Now, it looked forlorn and eerie, its once bright colors dulled to rust and grime. The wind made it creak softly, as if it were whispering secrets from days gone by. Standing there, gazing up at it, I felt a chill creep down my spine, as if the park itself was alive, watching us, waiting. We continued down the paths we used to know so well, each step echoing in the empty space around us. The comforting scent of popcorn and sweets was gone, replaced by the faint odor of rust and decay. Every step we took amplified the strange silence that surrounded us. Danny pointed out the ticket booths, abandoned and half-collapsed, where we used to buy tokens and wristbands. Now they stood like grave markers in a place that had once been filled with joy, their glass windows shattered and frames warped from years of neglect. As we approached the central plaza, where the paths to different rides converged, we found ourselves standing before the entrance to the roller coaster. Adventure Valley's pride and joy, Mayhem Mountain, loomed in the distance, its rusty tracks twisting against the twilight sky like the skeletal remains of a long-forgotten monster. The roller coaster had always been the highlight of the park, drawing crowds from all around. It had been our favorite ride, the place where we dared each other to conquer our fears. But standing there now, I felt a wave of unease as I looked at the faded sign, barely readable in the fading light. Charlotte broke the silence, her voice tinged with forced enthusiasm. "It's still standing," she said, as if trying to convince herself. We nodded, pretending to share her excitement, but the thrill we felt was mixed with an inexplicable dread. The park had changed, yes, but there was something more, a feeling that the very soul of Adventure Valley had shifted into something darker. Tyler stepped forward, determined to keep up the spirit of adventure. "Let's check it out," he said, his voice echoing off the empty walls. With a shared look of reluctant agreement, we followed him, winding our way through the debris-strewn paths toward Mayhem Mountain. As we walked, we passed other attractions that had once brought us joy. The bumper cars, the carousel, the funhouse. Each one was a shadow of its former self, overgrown with weeds and covered in graffiti, symbols and warnings that hinted at a history we knew nothing about. Finally, we reached the base of Mayhem Mountain. The control booth was covered in dust, the equipment inside long abandoned and rusting away. But on the control panel, one button stood out, Track B. None of us remembered this option from our childhood days. We exchanged puzzled glances, a mix of curiosity and trepidation swirling in the air. After a moment of silence, Brandon grinned mischievously. "Only one way to find out," he said, pressing the button with a flourish. The old, familiar clatter of the roller coaster's ascent filled the air, and we felt a spark of excitement that briefly washed away our unease. We strapped ourselves in, the harnesses clicking into place with a reassuringly familiar sound. For a brief moment I felt like a child again, ready to scream and laugh and enjoy the thrill of the ride. But as the coaster began its climb, I noticed the sky had darkened further, the last traces of sunlight disappearing behind the twisted metal of the track. Halfway up the climb, the lights on the track flickered and dimmed, and an unfamiliar feeling washed over me. The excitement was gone, replaced by a strange, creeping dread that settled into my bones. We reached the top, pausing for a moment before plunging forward, but instead of following the familiar loops and turns, the track veered off sharply, leading us down a path none of us had seen before. The coaster careened into a dark tunnel, the sudden shift jolting us from our seats. The darkness was thick, almost suffocating, and the only sounds were our collective gasps and the ominous creaks of the roller coaster as it twisted through unseen turns. I clung to the harness, my heart pounding as we spiraled deeper into the blackness. The longer we stayed on this unknown track, the more it felt like we were venturing into something forbidden, something we weren't meant to find. The coaster lurched suddenly, and our harnesses loosened ever so slightly, leaving us dangling in our seats as the cart continued its wild descent. Panic surged as I tried to hold on, my hands gripping the harness as tightly as I could. It felt as if we were no longer part of a ride, but participants in some twisted experiment, hurtling towards an end that promised nothing but darkness. This extended version of Part 1 deepens the atmosphere and builds tension, drawing readers into the haunting setting of Adventure Valley. I'll continue with Part 2 similarly if you'd like. If you're intrigued by what's happening so far, show your support by hitting the like button and sharing this video with anyone who loves a good scare. The rush of the unknown track faded, and the coaster's descent finally slowed to a crawl, its once deafening noise softening into an eerie silence. We found ourselves in a strange, cavernous space that felt detached from the rest of Adventure Valley. Dim, greenish lights flickered on, casting an unnatural glow over our surroundings, and I immediately noticed the walls, lined with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in sync with the low hum that filled the air. With unsteady legs, we unclipped our harnesses, stepping cautiously onto the platform. The air was thick and heavy, almost oppressive, carrying a damp, earthy scent that made me feel as if we were deep underground. I glanced around at the others, their faces mirroring the same mix of confusion and unease that twisted in my stomach. Brandon was the first to break the silence, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb something that lay hidden within the shadows. "What is this place?" he murmured, his eyes wide as he took in the strange symbols that lined the walls. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen, etched with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic. They twisted and turned in elaborate patterns, filling every inch of space with their ominous presence. Tyler, who'd always had a passion for history and languages, moved closer to examine them, running his fingers along the lines with a look of deep concentration. "These symbols, they're ancient," he muttered, his voice tinged with an uneasiness that made my skin prickle. "Some of them look like old runes, but others, I've never seen anything like them." An uneasy silence settled over us as we stared at the strange markings, each one more intricate and unsettling than the last. It felt as if the walls were alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seeped into the air, thickening it with each breath we took. I felt my chest tighten, a sense of dread washing over me as I realized that we had stumbled into something far more sinister than we had anticipated. Our eyes scanned the walls, tracing the symbols that seemed to tell a story, one we couldn't quite understand, but could feel in the depths of our bones. Danny clutched my arm, her fingers cold and trembling as she whispered, "I think we made a mistake coming here." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and ominous, and for the first time, I felt a pang of regret. We had come seeking adventure, a chance to relive the thrill of our childhood memories, but what we had found was something far darker, a hidden chamber, filled with secrets that had been buried for a reason. Adventure Valley was no longer the safe haven we remembered. It had become a labyrinth of fear and mystery, each turn revealing a new layer of horror that we weren't prepared to face. The hum grew louder, resonating through the walls and vibrating beneath our feet. It was as if the chamber itself was alive, pulsing with an energy that I couldn't quite place. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, twisting and contorting, as if they were watching us, judging us. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn deeper into a trap, one that we wouldn't easily escape. Scott moved towards the far end of the chamber, where a narrow hallway stretched into darkness. His flashlight barely pierced the blackness, but he took a tentative step forward, curiosity outweighing his fear. "Maybe there's another exit down here," he suggested, his voice wavering. With no other options, we followed him, our footsteps echoing ominously as we entered the narrow corridor. The walls closed in around us, and I felt as if we were descending further into the earth, each step pulling us deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me, adding a surreal quality to the already nightmarish atmosphere. The hallway twisted and turned, leading us through a maze of corridors that seemed to defy all logic. It was as if the very structure of Adventure Valley had shifted, transforming into a dark, labyrinthine realm that existed outside the boundaries of reality. We were no longer in the amusement park we knew. We had entered a place that was far older, a place that had been waiting, lurking in the shadows, biding its time. We turned a corner and found ourselves in another chamber, smaller than the first, but filled with even more symbols. This time, however, the symbols were painted in a deep crimson hue that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my heart race as I took in the macabre display. What do you think these mean?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if she feared waking something hidden within the shadows. Tyler shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but they don't look like anything good," he replied, his voice trembling with a fear he couldn't hide. We inched closer, examining the strange symbols with a mixture of horror and fascination. Each one seemed to tell a story, a twisted tale of sacrifice and ritual, of things that lurked in the darkness, waiting to be unleashed. My heart pounded as I realized that these markings were not just decorations. They were warnings, left by someone, or something, to keep intruders at bay. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the chamber, and we froze, our eyes darting toward the source of the noise. In the shadows, a figure appeared, its form obscured by the dim light. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it was in no hurry to reveal itself. My heart pounded as the figure stepped forward, its face hidden beneath a hood. But as it drew closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly green that matched the glow of the symbols on the walls. It didn't speak, but its gaze bore into us, conveying a message that needed no words. We had intruded into its domain, and it was not pleased. "Run," Brandon whispered, his voice barely a breath, but we were frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure took another step forward, and the symbols on the walls flared brighter, casting an eerie glow that filled the chamber. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and I felt as if I was being crushed under its gaze. Finally, the spell broke, and we bolted, our footsteps echoing through the chamber as we sprinted toward the exit. The figure watched us go, its glowing eyes following our every move, a silent promise of the horrors that awaited if we dared to return. Do you think you could handle a ride that took a terrifying twist like this? Leave a comment below, and let us know if you'd dare to ride again. The walls around us closed in, and every breath felt heavier as we moved through the twisting corridors, deeper into the labyrinth of darkness. The distant, echoing sound of the figure's steps lingered behind us, and though I couldn't see it, I could feel its gaze burning into our backs as we fled. The air grew colder with each step, an unnatural chill that seeped into our bones and made every hair on my body stand on end. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a shadow, a reminder that we were not alone, that something sinister was lurking just out of sight. Our footsteps echoed through the narrow hallways, bouncing off the cold stone walls and creating a cacophony of sound that felt both close and distant, like the twisted reflection of our own fear. The dim, flickering lights above us cast long, distorted shadows that danced along the walls, creating an illusion of movement that heightened the tension gripping our group. Every twist and turn of the corridor seemed to lead us deeper into the heart of the darkness, as though the park itself was guiding us toward something it wanted us to see, something it wanted us to experience. Charlotte's hand tightened around mine as we stumbled forward, her breathing ragged and filled with the same fear that clawed at my throat. Are we going in circles?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though she was afraid to disturb the silence. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that we'd find a way out, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. The corridors all looked the same, dark, narrow, and lined with those disturbing symbols that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. It felt as if we were trapped in a nightmare, caught in a maze that defied logic and reality. The oppressive silence was broken only by the distant hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls, filling the air with a tension that grew thicker with every passing second. Ahead of us, Tyler halted suddenly, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He pointed it down the corridor, illuminating a dark figure standing motionless at the end of the hallway, its face obscured by shadows. I felt my heart skip a beat as I realized it was the same figure we had seen before, the same hooded figure with those unnatural glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through us. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was enough to send a wave of terror washing over us. "We need to get out of here," Brandon muttered, his voice barely concealing his panic as he glanced over his shoulder, as though expecting the walls themselves to close in on us. With every step we took, the figure seemed to inch closer, even though it remained perfectly still. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, carrying it toward us, bridging the distance between us and it with every beat of our hearts. The corridor twisted again, and we turned only to find another figure waiting for us, this one standing just a few feet away, its face hidden beneath the same dark hood. I couldn't shake the feeling that these figures were not bound by the same rules of reality we were. They appeared and vanished like smoke, moving through the darkness with an eerie, silent grace that defied explanation. Our group stumbled back, fear tightening its grip around our hearts as we realized there was no escape, no clear path that would lead us back to the surface. The park had become a trap, a labyrinth of shadows and secrets that refused to let us go. The walls felt alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seeped into our skin, filling us with a dread that grew with every passing moment. Danny clutched my arm, her voice trembling. We need to do something. We can't just keep running," she whispered, desperation clear in her eyes as she looked around for any sign of escape. I knew she was right, but what could we do? The figures seemed to be everywhere, appearing and disappearing like phantoms, their glowing eyes watching us with a silent, unyielding intensity. They were closing in, their presence growing stronger, as though the darkness itself was bending to their will. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, casting an eerie glow that bathed everything in a sickly green light, illuminating our fear-stricken faces and making our shadows stretch and contort in unnatural shapes. In a moment of clarity, Tyler raised his flashlight, aiming it directly at the nearest figure. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating its face for the first time. What we saw made my blood run cold. The figure's skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins visible beneath the surface, pulsing with the same sickly green light that emanated from the walls. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stretch into an endless void, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile that sent a shiver down my spine. Without a word, we turned and ran, our footsteps pounding against the floor as we fled deeper into the labyrinth. The figures didn't chase us, but I could feel their gaze following us, their silent presence filling the air with a weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The corridors twisted and turned, each one looking more distorted and surreal than the last, as though the very structure of the park was shifting around us, trapping us in an endless maze of fear and darkness. We stumbled into another chamber, this one larger than the last, and my heart sank as I took in the sight before me. The walls were covered in mirrors, each one cracked and smeared with grime, reflecting twisted, distorted versions of ourselves that stared back at us with hollow, empty eyes. It was as if the mirrors were showing us not our true selves, but some dark, corrupted version of what we could become. Charlotte clutched my hand, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't real. It can't be real," she muttered, her gaze fixed on her reflection, which seemed to move independently, twisting and contorting into a grotesque smile that mirrored the expressions of the figures we had seen in the corridors. Before we could react, the mirrors began to vibrate, a low hum resonating through the chamber as the reflections twisted and distorted, their faces stretching and melting into nightmarish forms that defied all logic. I felt a surge of panic as the reflections reached out, their hands pressing against the glass as though trying to break free, to escape the prison of the mirrors and join us in the real world. Danny let out a scream, stumbling back as one of the reflections cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading across the surface as the glass began to bulge outward. The other reflections followed suit, their twisted forms pressing against the glass with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was as if they were alive, trapped in a prison of their own making, and they wanted nothing more than to escape and take our places in the real world. The glass shattered, and we ducked, shards raining down around us as the reflections broke free, their grotesque forms spilling into the chamber with a sickening squelch. They moved with unnatural grace, their limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied all anatomy as they crawled toward us, their hollow eyes fixed on us with a hunger that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Charlotte's hand and pulling her toward the nearest exit. We sprinted through the corridors, the sound of the reflections' twisted laughter echoing behind us as they pursued us, their footsteps a sickening, wet slap against the floor. Every turn led us deeper into the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running in circles, trapped in a nightmare with no end. The figures closed in, their twisted forms emerging from the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was no escape, no way out of the endless maze of mirrors and shadows that had become our prison. In a final act of desperation, I turned to face them, raising my flashlight in a futile attempt to ward them off. But they only laughed, their twisted faces contorting into grotesque smiles as they closed in, their voices a cacophony of whispers that filled the air with a sense of dread. This was it, the end of our journey, the end of everything we knew. We had entered Adventure Valley seeking adventure and thrill, but we had found something far darker, something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. As the darkness closed in, I took Charlotte's hand, holding her close as we faced the figures together, our hearts pounding in unison as we prepared for the inevitable. If you found this story spine-chilling, subscribe to Nightmare Narratives to experience more tales like this. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next terrifying story.